In the basement of a demolished Virginia manor house, beneath decades of accumulated dust and the weight of forgotten years, a leather-bound journal waited in silence. The workers who discovered it in March of 2019 could not have known they were holding the documented testament of Dr. Elias Whitmore, a physician whose careful observations would challenge everything we understand about the boundary between the living and the dead. The journal's pages, yellowed with age and brittle as autumn leaves, contained meticulous entries spanning from September 1827 through February 1828. Dr. Whitmore's handwriting, though faded, remained legible, a testament to the precision of a man trained in the careful documentation of human suffering. What he recorded during those months defied the rational explanations that his medical education had provided him. The case concerned a 7-year-old boy named Samuel Hartwell, who had not slept for over 3 months. Not the restless tossing of an anxious child, nor the brief interruptions common to fever dreams, but the complete absence of sleep itself. The boy's eyes, according to Dr. Whitmore's observations, had taken on a peculiar quality, not quite vacant, but as if they were focused on something beyond the immediate world around him. "The child stands at the window each night," Dr. Whitmore wrote in his entry dated October 15, 1827. His parents report that he speaks names they do not recognize, spoken in voices that seem too old for his young throat. The mother, Margaret Hartwell, has begun to show signs of profound distress. The father, Thomas, maintains a stoic demeanor, though I observe trembling in his hands when he believes himself unobserved. The Hartwell family had sought Dr. Whitmore's assistance as their final recourse. They had exhausted the remedies offered by local herbalists, endured the prayers and blessed oils of 3 different ministers, and even consulted with a woman known throughout Millbrook County for her understanding of what polite society preferred not to acknowledge. Nothing had restored young Samuel to the natural rhythm of sleep and waking that governs human existence. What distinguished this case from mere insomnia, however, was not simply the duration of the boy's wakefulness, but the nature of his nocturnal episodes. Beginning at sunset each day, Samuel would position himself at the eastern window of the family's parlor, pressing his small hands against the glass and speaking names with the clarity and conviction of someone recounting a familiar litany. "Ezra," he would whisper, "Patience, little Moses, Juba, Celia." The names meant nothing to the Hartwell family. They had arrived in Millbrook County only 6 months prior, purchasing their property from the estate of a man they had never met. Yet Samuel spoke these names as if calling to old friends, his voice carrying across the evening air toward the abandoned outbuildings that dotted their newly acquired land. Dr. Whitmore's initial examination revealed a child physically healthy yet profoundly altered. Samuel's pulse remained steady, his appetite adequate, his responses to questions coherent and appropriate for his age. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the boy's being, something that existed beyond the reach of conventional medical understanding. "I confess," Dr. Whitmore wrote, "that my training has not prepared me for such a case. The child exhibits no fever, no signs of delirium, no physical ailments that might account for his condition. Yet when darkness falls, he transforms into something I can only describe as a vessel, hollow and waiting to be filled with voices that do not belong to him." The physician's notes revealed his growing fascination with the specificity of Samuel's nocturnal recitations. The boy did not simply repeat the same names each night, but seemed to progress through an invisible roster, adding new names while never forgetting the old ones. By the time Dr. Whitmore began his documentation, Samuel's nightly litany included 15 distinct names, each spoken with the same reverent precision. As October gave way to November, the boy's condition intensified. The names were no longer whispered but spoken aloud, each one accompanied by what Samuel described as the knowing. Fragments of information about people he had never met, details about lives he had never witnessed. He spoke of Ezra's fondness for whistling while he worked, of Patience's skill with medicinal herbs, of little Moses's fear of thunderstorms. The Hartwell family's isolation grew with each passing night. Neighbors who had initially offered sympathy and assistance began to cross themselves when Samuel's voice carried across the evening air. The local minister, Reverend Thaddeus Morrison, visited twice, but declined to return after Samuel addressed him by the name of his deceased predecessor, a man who had died 5 years before the Hartwells' arrival in the county. Dr. Whitmore found himself drawn to the case not merely as a physician, but as a man confronting the limits of his understanding. His journal entries from this period reveal a careful observer struggling to reconcile empirical evidence with phenomena that challenged the very foundations of his scientific worldview. "I have witnessed the boy speak of events he could not possibly know," he wrote on November 3rd. Yesterday evening, he described the location of a well that was filled in before his family's arrival. This morning, I verified his description with elderly residents who remember the property from decades past. The well existed precisely where the child indicated, sealed over in 1819, following what local records describe only as an unfortunate incident. The threshold between the explicable and the impossible was growing thinner with each of Dr. Whitmore's visits to the Hartwell property. What had begun as a medical consultation was becoming something else entirely. A documentation of the permeable boundary between the world of the living and whatever realm housed the voices that spoke through young Samuel's lips each night. As November's chills settled over Millbrook County, Dr. Whitmore prepared to delve deeper into the history of the property where the sleepless boy stood vigil. The name Samuel spoke with such familiarity demanded investigation, and the physician found himself drawn inexorably toward discoveries that would test the limits of his rationality. The morning mist clung to the valleys of Millbrook County like a shroud, obscuring the boundaries between past and present as Dr. Whitmore made his way to the county courthouse. His investigation into young Samuel's condition had led him beyond the realm of medicine into the meticulous examination of property records, church registries, and the fragmentary documentation that serves as the skeleton of local history. Thomas Hartwell's acquisition of the property told a story common to Virginia in the 1820s. A family seeking opportunity in the aftermath of economic upheaval, drawn by the promise of fertile land at prices that seemed too favorable to question. The deed, signed on March 15, 1821, transferred 400 acres from the estate of Cornelius Blackwood to Thomas Hartwell for the sum of $800, less than half the amount such acreage typically commanded. The circumstances surrounding this generous pricing became clearer as Dr. Whitmore delved deeper into the Blackwood estate records. Cornelius Blackwood had departed Virginia abruptly in February of 1819, leaving behind not only his substantial holdings but also debts that had accumulated over several years of increasingly erratic behavior. Local residents, when pressed for details, spoke in the careful language of those who preferred certain subjects remain undisturbed. "The Blackwood place," explained courthouse clerk Jeremiah Matthews, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "was always a source of unease in the community. Cornelius kept to himself in his later years, rarely appearing in town except to purchase supplies or conduct business with certain unsavory characters from Richmond. The enslaved individuals on his property, well, their circumstances were a matter of considerable concern among the neighboring families." Dr. Whitmore's examination of church records revealed a troubling pattern. Between 1815 and 1819, the parish registry showed an unusual number of burial entries for individuals listed simply as property of C. Blackwood. The entries provided no details regarding cause of death, ages, or circumstances, merely names and dates, recorded with the bureaucratic efficiency reserved for the documentation of property rather than people. Young Samuel's transformation had begun precisely 3 months after the Hartwell family's relocation to the former Blackwood Manor. Margaret Hartwell's recollections of that period, shared during Dr. Whitmore's careful interviews, painted a picture of a family initially delighted with their new circumstances. The house, though requiring considerable repair, possessed the kind of architectural grandeur that spoke to aspirations of social advancement. The land was fertile, the location convenient to both Richmond and smaller trading posts. Samuel was so excited about his new room, Margaret recalled, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron as she spoke. It was larger than anything we could have afforded elsewhere, with windows that looked out over the fields. He would stand there in the mornings, watching the sun rise and talking about the adventures he would have exploring such a vast property. The change, when it came, was both gradual and absolute. Samuel began rising earlier, drawn to those same windows during the pre-dawn hours. His appetite diminished, though not to the point of concern. He spoke less during the day, conserving his voice, it seemed, for the names that would pour from his lips each evening. The first name he spoke was Patience. Margaret continued, "I thought perhaps he had made up an imaginary friend. Children do such things when adjusting to new surroundings, but the way he said it, there was such sadness in his voice, such longing, as if he were calling to someone who should have answered, but never would." Thomas Hartwell's response to his son's condition reflected the practical concerns of a man responsible for a family's survival in uncertain times. He consulted neighbors, sought medical advice, and attempted to maintain the routines of farm life even as his household grew increasingly isolated from the surrounding community. His journal, which Dr. Whitmore was permitted to examine, revealed a man struggling to balance rational explanations with increasingly irrational circumstances. November 10, 1827, Thomas had written, "Samuel spoke today of a garden that once grew behind the old slave quarters. He described it in detail. Rows of vegetables, medicinal herbs arranged according to some system he claimed to understand. When I investigated the area, I found the remains of cultivated beds, long overgrown but still visible to one who knew where to look. How could the boy know of such things?" The property itself seemed to hold memories in its very foundations. The main house, built in the Georgian style popular among Virginia planters, showed signs of hasty abandonment. Furniture remained covered with dust cloths, personal belongings left in drawers and cupboards, as if their owner had simply stepped away for a brief journey. In what had once served as Cornelius Blackwood's study, Dr. Whitmore discovered shelves lined with agricultural texts, medical journals, and volumes on subjects that ranged from natural philosophy to more esoteric topics that respectable gentlemen typically avoided. The slave quarters, though abandoned, bore witness to lives that had been lived within their confines. Personal belongings, carved wooden bowls, scraps of fabric, small tools, suggested a community that had existed parallel to but separate from the main house. Samuel's nightly vigil at the parlor window looked directly toward these structures, and his whispered name seemed to carry across the distance like prayers offered to an empty church. Dr. Whitmore's investigation revealed that the Blackwood property had been known throughout the county for its productivity, but also for its isolation. Neighboring families reported that social calls were discouraged, and that the enslaved individuals rarely appeared at market or community gatherings. This isolation, once Cornelius Blackwood's deliberate choice, had become the Hartwell family's unwitting inheritance. "We thought, and we were purchasing land," Margaret Hartwell confided during one of Dr. Whitmore's visits. "We did not realize we were also purchasing whatever remains when lives are ended without proper acknowledgement, without the rituals that allow the dead to rest in peace." As winter deepened over Millbrook County, Dr. Whitmore found himself confronting the possibility that young Samuel's condition might be connected not to any medical ailment, but to the unresolved history that seemed to permeate every inch of the Blackwood property. The names the boy spoke with such familiarity belonged, he was beginning to suspect, to individuals whose stories had been deliberately obscured, whose lives had ended in circumstances that demanded investigation. The physician's rational mind recoiled from such conclusions, yet his careful documentation of Samuel's statements continued to yield verifiable details about the property's past. Whatever force had awakened within the boy seemed determined to speak truths that others had worked to bury. Dr. Whitmore prepared to delve deeper into the shadows of the Blackwood legacy, following a trail of evidence that led inexorably toward revelations that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the nature of justice, memory, and the persistence of the human spirit. The archives of Millbrook County held their secrets reluctantly, requiring Dr. Whitmore to navigate layers of bureaucratic discretion and social propriety that had accumulated like sediment over the years since Cornelius Blackwood's departure. What emerged from his painstaking research was a pattern of documentation that spoke as much through its omissions as through its recorded facts. Between 1798 and 1819, the Blackwood plantation had been home to an average of 43 enslaved individuals, according to property assessments and tax records. Yet the careful tallies that appeared in official documents told only the most superficial story. Missing persons were noted as relocated or deceased, but the circumstances surrounding these changes in status were rarely elaborated upon. Dr. Whitmore's medical training had taught him to recognize the significance of patterns, and the pattern that emerged from these records suggested systematic concealment. The earliest troubling entry appeared in 1809 when a woman named Patience was listed among the deceased on the Blackwood property. The parish record noted her burial date, but provided no details regarding her age or the cause of her death. This same Patience was the first name young Samuel had spoken during his nightly vigils, her identity now emerging from the documentary shadows to claim recognition after nearly 2 decades of silence. Court records from the period revealed that Cornelius Blackwood had faced questions regarding his treatment of enslaved individuals on multiple occasions. Neighboring planters had filed formal complaints alleging excessive punishment and suspicious deaths, but these concerns had been dismissed by magistrates who cited Blackwood's property rights and the difficulty of obtaining reliable testimony from enslaved witnesses. The legal system that should have provided protection had instead become an instrument of concealment. Dr. Whitmore's investigation led him to Martha Henley, an elderly free woman of color who had served as a midwife throughout the county for over 40 years. Her memories of the Blackwood property carried the weight of witness suffering, though she spoke with the careful circumspection of someone who understood the dangers of speaking too freely about the affairs of powerful white men. Patience was my cousin, Martha revealed during a conversation conducted in the safety of her small cabin, away from the scrutiny of those who might disapprove of such discussions. She was skilled with healing herbs, knew which plants could ease pain and which could prevent conception. That knowledge made her valuable to the other enslaved women, but it also made her dangerous to Master Cornelius. The pattern of suspicious deaths extended beyond Patience to include others whose names Samuel had spoken. Ezra, a man known for his skill as a blacksmith; little Moses, a child of perhaps 10 years; Juba, who had served as a driver and held positions of responsibility within the enslaved community. Each death had been documented with the minimal notation required by law, but the circumstances surrounding their passing had been deliberately obscured. Martha's testimony revealed that Cornelius Blackwood had developed what he termed corrective measures designed to maintain absolute control over those he enslaved. These measures went far beyond the brutal but legally sanctioned punishments common to slavery, crossing into territory that even his contemporaries found disturbing. The isolation of the Blackwood property had provided cover for practices that would have drawn intervention had they occurred under more public scrutiny. He believed, Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper, that breaking the spirit was more important than breaking the body. He devised methods of punishment that left no visible marks but destroyed something essential in those who endured them. Some who survived his attention were never the same afterward. Others did not survive at all. Dr. Whitmore's journal entries from this period reflected his growing horror as the scope of Cornelius Blackwood's cruelties became apparent. The physician's medical training allowed him to interpret Martha's careful descriptions and understand the systematic nature of the abuse that had occurred on the property where young Samuel now stood vigil each night. The boy's condition had continued to intensify during Dr. Whitmore's investigation. Samuel's nightly recitations now included not merely names but fragments of personal history that provided increasingly specific details about the lives and deaths of those he had never known. The child spoke of Ezra's pride in his metalworking skills, of little Moses's fondness for a wooden toy horse, of Patience's secret garden where she cultivated plants for healing and other purposes. The boy describes events with a precision that defies explanation, Dr. Whitmore wrote on December 8, 1827. Yesterday evening he spoke of a gathering that took place in the slave quarters during the winter of 1815, a celebration of a marriage between 2 individuals whose names I have verified in property records. He described details of the ceremony, the songs that were sung, the foods that were shared, the makeshift altar constructed from objects salvaged from the main house. How could a 7-year-old child possess such knowledge? The discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the floorboards of the main house provided physical evidence to support the testimonies that Samuel channeled each night. Construction work necessitated by ongoing repairs revealed a space that had been deliberately concealed, accessible only through a narrow opening behind what had appeared to be a solid wall. Within this chamber, Dr. Whitmore found a collection of personal belongings that had clearly been hidden away. Carved wooden bowls, scraps of fabric sewn into intricate patterns, small tools, and items of spiritual significance that suggested the existence of cultural practices maintained in secret. Among these belongings were 15 small bundles, each containing personal effects that seemed to correspond to individual lives. The bundles were arranged with careful attention, suggesting they served as memorials or repositories of memory for those who had no official graves or markers. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed that many of the items bore names carved or stitched into their surfaces, names that matched those spoken nightly by young Samuel. The hidden chamber represented more than a repository of belongings. It was evidence of a community that had created its own methods of remembrance in the face of systematic attempts to erase their individual humanity. The care with which these memorial bundles had been prepared and preserved suggested that someone had been determined to ensure that the dead would not be forgotten, even if their stories could not be told openly. Martha Henley's knowledge of the hidden chamber confirmed Dr. Whitmore's growing understanding of the situation. They knew, she explained, that they might not survive to see justice in this world. But they believed that truth has a way of persisting even when those who would speak it are silenced. Those bundles were their way of preserving the evidence of lives that mattered, even when the law said those lives had no value. As December progressed toward the longest night of the year, Dr. Whitmore found himself confronting the possibility that young Samuel's sleeplessness was not a medical condition, but a form of spiritual responsibility. The boy had somehow become the vessel through which 15 silenced voices could finally speak their truths, bearing witness to crimes that had been deliberately concealed and calling for the acknowledgement that had been and denied them in life. The rational physician in Dr. Whitmore continued to seek explanations that would fit within the boundaries of accepted medical knowledge. Yet the evidence gathered through weeks of careful investigation pointed toward a conclusion that challenged the very foundations of his understanding. That some injustices create wounds in the fabric of reality itself, wounds that can only be healed when the truth is finally spoken and the dead are given the recognition they deserve. The boy's vigil continued, night after night, as winter's grip tightened over Millbrook County. Each evening brought new revelations, new details about lives that had been systematically erased from official memory. Samuel stood at his window, a 7-year-old child serving as the final witness to crimes that demanded justice, his sleepless state a testament to the persistence of truth in the face of deliberate concealment. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had led him into territory that his medical training had never prepared him to navigate. The rational explanations that had once provided comfort now seemed inadequate to address the phenomena he witnessed each evening at the Hartwell property. Young Samuel's condition had evolved beyond mere sleeplessness into something that challenged the very boundaries between the living and the dead. The boy's nightly recitations had become increasingly detailed, incorporating specific knowledge about the final moments of those whose names he spoke. Samuel described Patience's last night with the precision of an eyewitness, recounting how she had been dragged from her quarters to face Cornelius Blackwood's particular form of judgment. The child spoke of her dignity in the face of terror, her refusal to reveal the location of her medicinal stores, and her final words, a blessing spoken over those who would outlive her. Dr. Whitmore's documentation of these testimonies created a record of systematic brutality that had been deliberately obscured by those who perpetrated it. The physician found himself serving not merely as an observer, but as a scribe, recording testimonies that might otherwise be lost forever. His journal entries from this period reflected the weight of this responsibility and his growing understanding of the role he had been called to play. January 15, 1828, he wrote, "The boy spoke today of Ezra's final hours. According to Samuel's account, the man was subjected to what Blackwood termed correction for insolence, punishment that lasted 3 days and concluded with Ezra's death from wounds that were both extensive and precisely calculated to cause maximum suffering while avoiding immediate fatality." The child described the location where Ezra died, a storage building behind the main house. "When I investigated, I found stains on the wooden floor that could well be the evidence of what Samuel described." The testimonies revealed that Cornelius Blackwood's cruelties were not random acts of violence, but systematic attempts to break the will and spirit of those he enslaved. He had developed methods of punishment that were designed to terrorize the entire community, using individual suffering as an instrument of collective control. The isolation of his property had provided the perfect cover for these experiments in human degradation. Margaret Hartwell's own mental state had begun to deteriorate under the weight of her son's nightly revelations. The woman who had once spoken with pride about her family's new home now moved through the house like a shadow, starting at unexpected sounds and avoiding the windows that looked out toward the old slave quarters. Her sleep, when it came at all, was punctuated by nightmares that seemed to echo the testimonies her son delivered each evening. "I hear them too now," she confided to Dr. Whitmore during one of his visits. "Not as clearly as Samuel, but I hear whispers in the walls, footsteps in rooms that should be empty. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, figures that disappear when I turn to look directly. This house holds more than we bargained for when we signed those papers." Thomas Hartwell maintained his stoic exterior, but Dr. Whitmore observed signs of profound stress in the man's increasingly haggard appearance and the tremor that had developed in his hands. The family's isolation from their neighbors had deepened as word spread of the strange happenings at the former Blackwood property. Children were forbidden from playing near their land, and even the local minister had ceased his visits after Samuel addressed him with knowledge of sins that had never been confessed. The boy's condition reached a crescendo during the final weeks of January. Samuel's testimonies now included not only individual accounts of suffering but revelations about Cornelius Blackwood's broader system of control. The child spoke of forced breeding arrangements designed to produce children who could be sold for profit, of deliberate starvation used as punishment, and of psychological tortures that broke minds more thoroughly than physical violence ever could. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had uncovered evidence supporting these testimonies in the form of bills of sale, correspondence with slave traders, and financial records that revealed the calculated cruelty behind Blackwood's operations. The physician found invoices for shackles and restraining devices that went far beyond what would be necessary for ordinary agricultural work, suggesting instruments designed specifically for punishment and confinement. The hidden chamber beneath the house yielded additional evidence as Dr. Whitmore's careful examination continued. Among the memorial bundles, he discovered fragments of written testimonies, scraps of paper on which someone had recorded accounts of abuse and murder, hidden away against the possibility that justice might someday be possible. The handwriting was crude but legible, suggesting that at least one of Blackwood's victims had possessed literacy despite laws that forbade educating enslaved individuals. These written fragments provided names and dates that corroborated Samuel's nightly testimonies. They described a reign of terror that had lasted for over a decade, during which Cornelius Blackwood had transformed his property into what could only be described as a theater of systematic cruelty. The documents revealed that some of the deaths had been witnessed by multiple individuals, but fear of retaliation had prevented anyone from reporting what they had observed. Samuel's role as a conduit for these voices had begun to take a physical toll on the child. His small frame had grown thinner, his eyes more deeply shadowed, and his skin had taken on a pallor that spoke of profound exhaustion despite his inability to sleep. Dr. Whitmore recognized the signs of a system under enormous stress, though the source of that stress remained beyond the reach of conventional medical intervention. The boy's testimonies revealed that the 15 names he spoke belonged to individuals who had been murdered over a period spanning from 1809 to 1819, with the killings becoming more frequent and more elaborate as Cornelius Blackwood's psychological condition deteriorated. The pattern suggested a man who had lost whatever moral constraints might have once governed his behavior, descending into depths of cruelty that horrified even his contemporaries. "The child bears witness to atrocities that were deliberately concealed," Dr. Whitmore wrote on January 28, 1828. "Through him, voices that were silenced by violence speak truths that demand acknowledgement. I find myself questioning the nature of death itself, wondering whether the injustices perpetrated on this property have created some form of spiritual wound that cannot heal until the truth is finally told." The physician's growing understanding of his role as documenter and witness had begun to provide a framework for what might be necessary to resolve Samuel's condition. The boy's sleeplessness seemed connected to an obligation that transcended normal human experience, a debt owed to the dead that could only be paid through the recognition and recording of their suffering. As February arrived with its promise of longer days and eventual spring, Dr. Whitmore prepared for what he sensed would be the culmination of his involvement in the case. The testimonies channeled through young Samuel had created a complete record of Cornelius Blackwood's crimes, but documentation alone might not be sufficient to provide the peace that the dead seemed to be seeking. Something more would be required, an act of acknowledgement and justice that could bridge the gap between the world of the living and whatever realm housed the voices that spoke through the sleepless child. The discovery of Cornelius Blackwood's private journal marked the moment when Dr. Whitmore's investigation crossed from the realm of mystery into the territory of absolute horror. Hidden within a cavity behind what had appeared to be a solid wall in Blackwood's former study, the journal contained detailed accounts of systematic torture and murder that surpassed even the testimonies channeled through young Samuel. Blackwood's handwriting revealed a mind that had rationalized atrocity through a perverted philosophy of control and ownership. The journal entries dating from 1807 through February 1819 documented not merely the deaths of 15 individuals but the deliberate methods by which Cornelius Blackwood had sought to break their spirits before ending their lives. His writing suggested a man who had come to view human suffering as a form of scientific inquiry, recording his observations with the clinical detachment of a natural philosopher conducting experiments. February 10, 1815, Blackwood had written, "The subject Patience continues to resist correction despite 3 days of intensive instruction. Her knowledge of herbal preparations presents a particular challenge, as others look to her for guidance in matters that should remain under proper authority. Today, I implemented a new approach designed to address her influence over the others. The results will be carefully observed and documented." Dr. Whitmore's medical training allowed him to decode the euphemisms in Blackwood's journal and understand the true nature of the corrections and intensive instruction described within its pages. The former plantation owner had developed techniques of torture that were designed to maximize psychological trauma while avoiding immediate death, prolonging suffering in ways that suggested a systematic study of human endurance and breaking points. The journal revealed that Blackwood's experiments had been guided by a belief that the souls of those he murdered could be bound to serve him even after death, trapped within the boundaries of his property to ensure their continued subjugation. His writings described rituals performed during and after the killings, complex procedures that combined elements of folk magic with his own twisted interpretations of religious doctrine. "The binding requires precision," one entry explained. "Death alone is insufficient. The spirit must be captured at the moment of departure and anchored to the physical realm through objects of personal significance. The arrangements I have made should ensure that these subjects remain available for future use, their essence preserved within the boundaries of my property." Young Samuel's condition reached its most intense phase as Dr. Whitmore studied Blackwood's journal. The boy's nightly testimonies now included not only accounts of individual suffering, but details about the rituals that had been performed to prevent the souls of the murdered from finding peace. Samuel spoke with the voice of each victim, describing their final moments and the additional horror of realizing that their deaths were not the end of their torment. The child's physical condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Whitmore feared for his survival. Samuel's weight had dropped dramatically. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, and his eyes had developed a feverish brightness that spoke of systems pushed beyond their limits. Yet the boy continued his vigil each night, standing at the parlor window and speaking the testimonies that demanded to be heard. Margaret Hartwell had begun to experience phenomena that suggested the spiritual disturbance on the property was expanding beyond her son's unique sensitivity. She reported seeing figures moving through the house during daylight hours, hearing conversations in empty rooms, and finding objects moved from their original positions despite no one having touched them. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead seemed to be dissolving as the truth of what had occurred on the property demanded acknowledgement. Dr. Whitmore realized that his role as observer and documenter was insufficient to address the crisis unfolding before him. The voices speaking through Samuel were not seeking merely recognition, but justice, a formal acknowledgement of the crimes committed against them and the binding rituals that had prevented their spirits from finding rest. The physician found himself confronting responsibilities that extended far beyond his medical training. On the night of February 14, 1828, Dr. Whitmore made the decision that would transform his involvement in the case from passive documentation to active intervention. Armed with the complete record of Blackwood's crimes and the testimonies he had faithfully recorded over months of careful observation, he prepared to serve as witness and advocate for the 15 souls whose suffering had been deliberately concealed. The ceremony, if such it could be called, took place in the parlor where Samuel maintained his nightly vigil. Dr. Whitmore had arranged the memorial bundles from the hidden chamber in a circle around the room, each bundle representing one of the murdered individuals whose names the boy had spoken with such devotion. The physician understood that he was participating in something that transcended the boundaries of conventional religion or medicine, serving as the instrument through which acknowledgement and justice might finally be achieved. As darkness fell, Samuel took his customary place at the window, but instead of beginning his usual recitation of names, the boy turned to face Dr. Whitmore with eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond his 7 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the accumulated weight of 15 silenced testimonies, each seeking the recognition that had been denied them in life. Dr. Whitmore began to read aloud from his journals, recounting each testimony in detail and acknowledging the suffering and dignity of every individual whose story had been channeled through the sleepless child. He spoke their names with the reverence due to human beings whose lives had been stolen and whose deaths had been concealed. As he read, the room seemed to fill with a presence that was both profound and peaceful, as if spirits long trapped were finally able to hear their stories acknowledged by someone with the authority to bear witness. The reading continued through the night, with Dr. Whitmore serving as the voice that had been denied to the dead for nearly a decade. He recounted not only their suffering but their resistance, their dignity in the face of unspeakable cruelty, and their determination to preserve some record of truth for future discovery. Each name became a prayer, each testimony an act of restoration. As dawn approached and Dr. Whitmore spoke the final words of acknowledgement, young Samuel closed his eyes for the first time in over 3 months. The boy's breathing deepened into the natural rhythm of sleep, his small frame finally able to release the terrible burden he had carried through the long winter nights. The voices that had spoken through him had found the witness they needed, the recognition that allowed them to complete their journey toward whatever peace awaited beyond the boundaries of the physical world. Dr. Whitmore remained in the parlor as Samuel slept, watching over the child and reflecting on the extraordinary events he had witnessed and participated in. The physician understood that he had been privileged to serve as the instrument through which justice had been achieved, not the legal justice that had been denied in life, but the deeper justice of acknowledgement and remembrance that transcends the limitations of human law. The Blackwood property would never again be home to the same spiritual disturbance that had claimed young Samuel as its unwilling medium. The voices that had demanded to be heard had finally found their witness, and the dead could rest in the peace that had been denied them for so long. Samuel's recovery marked the beginning of a new phase in Dr. Whitmore's involvement with the case, one that tested his sense of moral obligation and professional responsibility. The boy's ability to sleep naturally had returned as suddenly as it had departed, leaving behind only the detailed testimonies recorded in the physician's journals as evidence of the extraordinary events that had transpired during those months of spiritual witness. Dr. Whitmore's attempt to pursue legal justice for the crimes documented in Cornelius Blackwood's journal led him through a labyrinth of bureaucratic indifference and social resistance. The magistrates who had dismissed concerns about Blackwood's treatment of enslaved individuals during his lifetime showed no greater interest in pursuing posthumous justice. The legal system that had failed to protect the victims while they lived proved equally unwilling to acknowledge their suffering after their deaths. The physician's inquiries into Blackwood's current whereabouts revealed that the former plantation owner had died in New Orleans in August of 1825, succumbing to yellow fever while attempting to establish a new plantation in Louisiana. The man who had orchestrated the systematic murder of 15 human beings had escaped earthly justice, taking his secrets to an unmarked grave in a pauper cemetery far from the scene of his crimes. This revelation forced Dr. Whitmore to confront the limitations of conventional justice while grappling with the moral weight of the knowledge he possessed. His journals contained detailed documentation of atrocities that would never see the inside of a courtroom, testimonies that had been delivered by voices from beyond death but would hold no legal standing in any earthly proceeding. The physician found himself wrestling with questions that extended far beyond the boundaries of medicine or law. March 8, 1828, Dr. Whitmore wrote, "I am confronted with evidence of crimes that demand prosecution, yet the perpetrator lies beyond the reach of human justice. The testimonies I have recorded represent the final opportunity for these voices to be heard, but I find myself uncertain of my obligations as their sole witness. What duty do I owe to the dead when the living have chosen to forget?" The decision to document the testimonies in their entirety, despite their supernatural origin, reflected Dr. Whitmore's understanding that some forms of truth transcend the conventional boundaries of evidence and testimony. His medical training had taught him to observe and record phenomena accurately, regardless of whether they conform to accepted explanations. The voices that had spoken through young Samuel deserved the same careful documentation that he would provide for any patient under his care. The Hartwell family's response to their son's recovery was complicated by their knowledge of what his condition had revealed about their new home. Thomas Hartwell found himself unable to work the fields where he now knew 15 people had been tortured and murdered. Margaret Hartwell could not enter rooms where she had witnessed her son channeling the voices of the dead. The house that had once represented their aspirations for a better life had become a monument to suffering that I could no longer ignore. "We thought we were purchasing property," Thomas confided to Dr. Whitmore during one of the physician's final visits to the family. "We never imagined we were also inheriting the responsibility for acknowledging crimes that others had worked so hard to conceal. Samuel's recovery has given us back our son, but it has also given us knowledge that we do not know how to bear." The family's decision to abandon the property came gradually, emerging from weeks of discussion and careful consideration of their limited options. They could not sell land that carried such a history to another unsuspecting family, yet they lacked the resources to maintain property they could no longer inhabit comfortably. Their departure from Millbrook County represented not flight but acknowledgement, a recognition that some places hold memories too powerful to be ignored or forgotten. Dr. Whitmore's own relationship with the property evolved during the months following Samuel's recovery. He found himself returning regularly, not as a physician treating a patient, but as a guardian of the testimonies that had been entrusted to his care. The hidden chamber beneath the house became a kind of shrine where he would read aloud from his journals, ensuring that the voices of the dead continued to be heard even after their primary witness had returned to normal childhood. The physician's vigil at the abandoned Blackwood Manor became a source of local speculation and concern. Neighbors who observed his regular visits whispered about the doctor's mental state, wondering if his involvement in young Samuel's strange case had affected his own grip on reality. Dr. Whitmore was aware of these concerns but felt bound by obligations that transcended social expectations or professional reputation. "I have become the keeper of testimonies that must not be allowed to fade into silence," he wrote in April of 1828. "The voices that spoke through Samuel have entrusted me with their stories, and I understand now that my role extends beyond that of physician or observer. I am their advocate in a world that prefers to forget rather than confront the consequences of systematic evil." The doctor's documentation expanded beyond the original testimonies to include his research into the historical context of Blackwood's crimes and their connection to broader patterns of violence and exploitation. His journals became a comprehensive record not only of individual suffering, but of the social and legal structures that had enabled such atrocities to occur without consequence. The case had transformed from a medical mystery into a profound examination of justice, memory, and moral responsibility. Local authorities' responses to Dr. Whitmore's documentation reflected the same institutional indifference that had protected Cornelius Blackwood during his lifetime. Magistrates declined to review evidence obtained through supernatural means. Church leaders questioned the propriety of acknowledging testimony from the dead, and community leaders preferred to treat the entire matter as an unfortunate aberration rather than a symptom of systemic failure. The physician's isolation grew as his commitment to honoring the testimonies placed him at odds with social expectations and professional norms. Yet he found strength in the certainty that his documentation served a purpose beyond conventional understanding. The voices that had demanded to be heard through young Samuel had chosen him as their witness for reasons that transcended mere coincidence or medical curiosity. Dr. Whitmore's final entries regarding the case reflected his acceptance of a role that combined elements of physician, Hystison, Orion, and spiritual guardian. His responsibility to the dead had become as important as his obligations to the living, creating a form of practice that existed at the intersection of medicine, morality, and metaphysics. The testimonies would be preserved, their truth acknowledged, and their call for justice honored, even if earthly courts remained closed to their appeals. As spring gave way to summer in 1828, Dr. Whitmore established a routine of monthly visits to the abandoned property, reading aloud from his journals and maintaining the memorial arrangements in the hidden chamber. These acts of remembrance represented his understanding that some obligations transcend death itself, that witness and acknowledgement can provide forms of justice unavailable through conventional legal channels. The empty manor stood as a testament to the persistence of truth and the power of voices that refuse to be silenced, even when those who would speak for them have passed beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence. Dr. Whitmore's vigil continued, ensuring that 15 murdered souls would not be forgotten, and that their testimonies would survive to challenge future generations with questions about justice, memory, and the responsibilities we owe to those whose suffering we have the power to acknowledge or ignore. The autumn of 2019 brought Dr. Whitmore's journal into the hands of researchers who could scarcely have imagined the historical treasures concealed within its yellowed pages. The demolition of the Hartwell property, as it had come to be known in local records, had been necessitated by structural damage that made the building unsafe for occupation. But the discovery of the physician's documentation transformed what might have been routine historical preservation into something far more significant. Professor Elena Vasquez of the Virginia Historical Society approached the journal with the methodical care of someone accustomed to handling documents of uncertain provenance. Her initial skepticism regarding the supernatural elements of Dr. Whitmore's account gave way to growing fascination as her research team began to verify the historical details embedded within the narrative. Church records, court documents, property deeds, and tax assessments provided confirmation for fact after fact recorded in the physician's careful hand. The 15 names that young Samuel had spoken during his months of sleeplessness appeared in fragmentary records scattered across various archives. Patience, Ezra, Little Moses, Juba, Celia, each name corresponded to individuals listed as property of Cornelius Blackwood during the years documented in Dr. Whitmore's journal. The precision of dates, relationships, and personal details recorded in the testimonies matched information that existed in official records but had never been compiled into a comprehensive narrative. Archaeological investigation of the former Blackwood property yielded physical evidence that corroborated many of Dr. Whitmore's claims. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the location of the filled well that Samuel had described with impossible accuracy. Excavation of the slave quarters uncovered artifacts that matched items described in the boys' testimonies. Carved wooden bowls, metal tools bearing distinctive markings, and scraps of fabric that analysis revealed to be consistent with early 19th century materials. The hidden chamber that Dr. Whitmore had discovered remained largely intact, its contents preserved by the same damp conditions that had protected the physician's journal. The memorial bundles described in his documentation were found exactly as he had recorded them, each containing personal effects that served as tangible connections to lives that official records had reduced to mere property listings. Carbon dating confirmed that the organic materials within the bundles originated from the period documented in Dr. Whitmore's account. Professor Vasquez's research team discovered additional documentation that had escaped Dr. Whitmore's investigation, but supported his conclusions about Cornelius Blackwood's systematic cruelties. Correspondence between Blackwood and slave traders revealed his specific requests for individuals who could be easily isolated from existing communities, suggesting a deliberate strategy of acquiring victims who would not be missed. Financial records indicated payments for specialized restraining devices and tools that serve no legitimate agricultural purpose. The verification of historical details contained within Dr. Whitmore's journal raised profound questions about the nature of the testimonies recorded during Samuel's sleepless months. While researchers could confirm the accuracy of names, dates, and circumstances, the mechanism by which a 7-year-old child had acquired such detailed knowledge remained beyond conventional explanation. The precision of the information channeled through the boy suggested access to records that no longer existed or had never been officially documented. Contemporary accounts from Millbrook County residents provided additional context for the events Dr. Whitmore had recorded. Local newspapers from the 1820s contained brief mentions of the Hartwell family's unusual circumstances, though the supernatural elements had been carefully omitted from public discussion. Letters and diaries preserved in family collections referenced the strange happenings at the former Blackwood property, confirming that the community had been aware of Samuel's condition, even if they preferred not to discuss it openly. The documentation of Dr. Whitmore's continued vigil at the abandoned property appeared in various forms throughout the county's historical record. Neighbors' accounts, church records, and even legal documents related to property maintenance reference the physician's regular visits to the empty manor. His dedication to preserving the testimonies had become a local legend, spoken of in the careful language reserved for subjects that challenged conventional understanding. The final entry in Dr. Whitmore's journal, dated December 1850, revealed the physician's understanding that his role as keeper of the testimonies would not end with his own death. He had made arrangements for his documentation to be preserved within the structure of the house itself, sealed away until such time as changing circumstances might allow the stories to be told, without endangering those who told them. His final words reflected a lifetime spent grappling with questions that transcended the boundaries of medicine, law, and conventional morality. "I have served as witness to truths that my era lacks the courage to acknowledge," he had written. "Perhaps future generations will possess the wisdom and compassion necessary to understand that justice delayed is not justice denied, that memory persists even when official records are destroyed, and that some voices demand to be heard regardless of the comfort of those who would prefer silence." Modern investigations of the property where the Blackwood Manor once stood have yielded reports that echo the phenomena Dr. Whitmore documented nearly 2 centuries earlier. Children playing in the area speak of hearing their names called by voices they cannot identify. Hikers report encountering figures that vanish when approached directly. Local residents mention dreams that feel more like memories, filled with details about lives they have never lived, and Plan says they have never seen. The Virginia Historical Society's publication of Dr. Whitmore's journal sparked debates about the nature of historical testimony and the responsibilities that scholars owe to stories that cannot be verified through conventional means. Some researchers argued that the supernatural elements of the account discredited its historical value, while others contended that the documented accuracy of verifiable details demanded serious consideration of the entire narrative. The 15 individuals whose names Samuel Hartwell spoke during those long winter nights of 1827 and 1828 have finally received the recognition they were denied in life. Their stories, preserved through the testimony of a sleepless child and the careful documentation of a dedicated physician, stand as a testament to the persistence of truth in the face of systematic concealment. They remind us that some voices refuse to be silenced, that memory can transcend death itself, and that justice, though delayed, may yet find expression through the most unexpected channels. The empty fields where the Blackwood Manor once stood remain a place of pilgrimage for those who understand that the past continues to speak to those willing to listen. The echoes that remain serve as reminders that history is written not only by the victorious, but by those who refuse to let the dead be forgotten, ensuring that even the most deliberately concealed truths will eventually find their way into the light. In the quiet moments just before dawn, when the boundary between night and day grows thin, some visitors to the site report hearing whispers carried on the morning wind, names spoken with the reverence due to human beings whose lives mattered, whose deaths demanded acknowledgement, and whose stories finally found the witness they had been seeking for nearly 2 centuries. The boy who never slept had given them back their voices, and those voices continue to speak to any who have the courage to hear their testimony.